So, how do we make sense of all the different ways that countries are governed? From monarchies to democracies, the labels we use are a lot more than just words. They're actually the tools we need to understand how power works. In this explainer, we're going to break down the frameworks that define political systems around the world.
And to see why this is so important, let's just try a little thought experiment. How would you even begin to compare the government of Norway with the government of North Korea? I mean, on the surface, sure, they're both countries, they have leaders, they have laws, but one is a thriving, stable democracy and the other is a deeply totalitarian state. To even start talking about these huge differences, we need a shared vocabulary, a framework that lets us compare them. Here's our game plan. First, we're going to explore why we even bother classifying governments in the first place. Then we'll take a quick trip through the history of these labels, from ancient thinkers all the way to modern times. After that, we'll dive into the current political spectrum, and we'll wrap things up by asking what this all might mean for the future.
All right, first up, why even bother with all these labels? Well, to put it simply, it's the single most important tool we have for understanding how politics really works on a global scale. It really boils down to two main things. First, there's analysis. We compare systems to figure out how they tick, what they have in common, and what makes them different. It's like the political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville said, without comparisons to make, the mind does not know how to proceed. And second, there's evaluation, trying to judge which systems work better, which helps us think about how we might reform our own. So, where did all these labels even come from? Well, believe it or not, we've been trying to classify governments for thousands of years, and the terms we use today are really built on centuries and centuries of political thought. The first really big attempt came from, you guessed it, Aristotle. He studied 158 different city-states and sorted them using just two simple questions: who's in charge and who actually benefits from their rule. So a government that served everyone was a good one, like a monarchy. But if it only served the people in charge, it was a debased or corrupt version, like a tyranny. And this simple grid, it was so powerful, it basically shaped how people thought about politics for over 2,000 years. But of course, that model didn't last forever. Fast forward to the Enlightenment, and you get new ideas from thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu, big concepts like constitutional government and the separation of powers. Then, by the 20th century, the whole way we looked at it had shifted again, splitting the world into a simple binary. You were either a democratic state or a totalitarian one. This kind of binary thinking really hardened during the Cold War into what we call the three worlds model. You had your capitalist first world aligned with the US, you had your communist second world aligned with the Soviet Union, and then there was the third world, which was mostly developing nations that were often non-aligned. This map was drawn along ideological and military lines. But when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War fizzled out, this whole map became useless almost overnight. Okay, so that brings us to today. Now, we tend to classify regimes on a spectrum, really based on how democratic they are in practice. It's not just a yes or no question anymore. At the top end of that spectrum, you've got your full democracies. And here's the key takeaway. Democracy is way more than just showing up to vote. It means you have protected rights, people can actually participate in a meaningful way, and there's a whole political culture that supports these democratic values. But even these systems aren't perfect, right? Many are facing modern challenges like political polarization and declining trust in institutions. And this slide just nails the key features. You need competitive parties, guaranteed freedoms, a free press so people know what's going on, and real chances for people to get involved. When power is spread out this broadly, political scientists have a cool term for it: polyarchy. It literally just means rule by the many. And a perfect example of this is Norway, which you see right here. It consistently tops the global democracy rankings, precisely because it puts all these principles into practice. It's got a long tradition of sharing power and respecting rights. But it's important to know that not all full democracies work the same way. A majoritarian system like the one in the UK tends to concentrate power with the party that wins the election. It creates a very adversarial, kind of a winner-take-all political culture. On the other hand, a consensus system, like in Belgium, spreads that power out, forcing parties to work together in coalitions and negotiate compromises. It's all about teamwork. Okay, now we're moving into a much more complicated and honestly a much bigger category: flawed democracies. These are countries that have elections, they have democratic institutions on paper, but in the real world, there are deep-seated systemic problems that really weaken them. And this is actually the most common type of government in the world today. So to get a handle on this big category, we can split it into 4 types. In a delegative democracy, one person, usually the president, is just way too powerful. In a domain democracy, some powerful group like the military has the final say on certain issues. An exclusive democracy is one that just shuts out entire parts of the population. And then there's the one we hear about all the time these days, illiberal democracy. And the journalist Fareed Zakaria just puts it perfectly here. These are regimes where leaders get elected, but then they turn around and just ignore the Constitution and start chipping away at basic rights and freedoms. It's like you get the election part of democracy, but you lose the whole protecting rights and freedoms part. It's democracy, but without the liberalism. And this rise of illiberalism, it's part of a bigger and pretty worrying trend called democratic backsliding. This is where countries, even ones that have been democracies for a long time, start to gradually become less free and less democratic over time. Okay, let's shift gears and move to the other end of the spectrum. We're talking about regimes where democratic features are either just for show or they're completely gone. Now, here's a really key distinction. A hybrid regime keeps up the appearance of democracy. They'll hold elections, but everyone knows they're rigged so the rulers can't lose. An authoritarian regime, on the other hand, doesn't even bother with the pretense. Power is held by an elite that was never elected, and what the people want is simply ignored. Modern authoritarianism usually falls into one of three buckets. You've got your personalist regimes, which are built around one person's cult of personality. You've got your one-party states, where a single political party controls pretty much everything. And you have military regimes, where the armed forces just take direct control of the government. And this photo from Burkina Faso, back in 2022, is just a raw, powerful example of a modern military regime. After a coup d'etat, normal political life is just suspended, and the military's chain of command becomes the government. So, after all that, where does this leave us? What do all these labels and categories tell us about where things are heading? You know, after the Cold War ended, some thinkers famously talked about the end of history. The idea was that liberal democracy had basically won and was the final, best form of human government. And for a while, its spread around the world seemed to support that. But the rise of illiberalism, democratic backsliding, and frankly, the success of authoritarian models like China's have thrown a huge wrench in that whole idea. Which leaves us with the million-dollar question. Does the future belong to democracy, or is authoritarianism making a comeback? Or maybe the future is something messier, something in between, a world dominated by all those flawed democracies and hybrid regimes living in that huge middle ground. The answer to that is going to define our century. Thanks for watching.